So as always, I would like to begin with the basic understanding of the whole view, the whole journey of spirituality here in this particular path known as the path of Buddhism. Can you hear me? There? Yes? Okay. So, it is clear that the teachings of the Buddha is basically a way of working with our mind, fundamentally learning how to understand our mind and its nature and how we can work with it and how we can work with its different manifestations. And so basic Buddhist approach to this fundamental question is approached through the two truths, the absolute truth and the relative truth. Mind, what is mind from the absolute point of view is that our mind is a basic state of wakefulness. It's in the state of a basic wakefulness. It's in the state of a basic awareness. It's in the state of a complete purity in its essence, in the absolute or ultimate reality. And that nature of a wakeful mind is nothing different from the mind of all the Buddhas. The wisdom of enlightenment is nothing different from this basic state of our mind, the basic nature of our consciousness. And so therefore, from the ultimate point of view, then Buddha said, our mind is in the nature of a complete enlightenment right from the beginning. That's the absolute nature of a mind. And that absolute nature of a mind goes beyond all our conceptual, dualistic understanding of mind. It is the genuine essence, which is in the essence of completely pure and genuinely awake nature. And this is sometimes in Buddhist teachings called emptiness. This nature of mind is called emptiness. Why? Because it is empty of duality, empty of ego, self-centered view. It's empty of relative confusion. Such things do not exist in this nature, therefore it is called emptiness. Its basic state is fundamentally free from all conceptual clinging. That's the first nature of a mind. And then the second aspect of mind, the approaching our mind, is from the relative truth, the second truth. Relative or conventional truth. And so from the point of view of a relative or conventional truth, then mind manifests, appears as duality, right? There's a subject, there's an object, there's the action. All these experiences of mind within the realm, range of duality is a relative experience. Within that dualistic experience, then we go through such experiences as ego clinging, self-clinging, self-centricity, right? There's a sense of a reference point as being I or me, the self. Because of this, then we automatically, naturally project something called others, right? If there's a self, then there's others. Like, for example, when you have this side of a river bank, when you say this side of the river, that means naturally it's showing there's the other side. Likewise, when we cling on to oneself as I, or when we cling on to something as other, then that naturally implies the other side of duality. So it doesn't matter where you fixate, whether it's a self or other, whether it's a self of a person or whether it's a self of a phenomena. When you fixate on one particular self, then that projects the other element of duality, right? It's actually it's like a quark, isn't it? Those, what you call that quark, when you separate, it's like stretching, they say, right? So when you try to separate these elements within the quark, what do you call that? It's up and down or something it's called. And they say when you finally separate, then it produces another one, third one, or something like that. So there's always this sense of duality projecting, coming out of this clinging onto self, fixating on. From there, then we experience emotions, disturbing emotions, right? When there's a self and others, then relating with these dualistic phenomena, then we get naturally into the game of emotions, disturbing emotions. Towards something called a pleasant object, we feel attachment, clinging. Towards something called unpleasant object, then we feel aversion. Towards something called neutral objects, then we feel numb. No, just kidding. Then we feel neutral. And so, therefore, from duality, then we get engaged into these objects, subject-object relationship. Then from there, then we experience so much suffering arising from that. From the whole process of duality, we experience so much suffering, so much pain from these emotions, disturbing emotions, from ego clinging. And so therefore, the relative aspect of a mind and its experience goes through this experience of duality, the relative mind. And so therefore, the Buddha's teaching, the complete cycle of Buddha's teaching shows nothing but how to work with these two aspects of our mind, how to work with this mind, how to discover this ultimate mind, which we don't see it in our ordinary mundane mind. We try to discover that, try to see, yes, this is the ultimate nature of mind. Try to see the absolute reality of mind, which is actually discovering and beginning to know our own mind. What is our own mind? What is its real nature, the essence? And the second aspect of this path is how to work with these disturbing emotions, how to work with our ego clinging, how to work with the whole duality, and how we can transform it, how we can go beyond this duality. That's what this is all about. The path of Buddhism. And so such a path of Buddha Dharma or Buddhism or spiritual journey here begins with the path of Hinayana, which is the first path that the Buddha taught. Hinayana, which means a lower vehicle. The lower here means a foundational. Lower here means more basic, fundamental. That's what lower means here. Like when we say lower part of the building, right? The lower part of the building is the foundational part. Without that foundation, the 100th floor cannot exist. 70th floor cannot exist. The second floor cannot exist. First floor cannot exist without that foundation. So that's why this is very important vehicle, important journey. It's called the Hinayana. This yana, or this vehicle, primarily focuses on the thought of renunciation. That becomes very important here. The first and the foremost in beginning our journey here in Buddhism is discovering this heart of renunciation. What is renunciation? Renunciation is a thought of wanting to free oneself from suffering and the causes of suffering. That's what renunciation is here. This renunciation doesn't mean renouncing the world, necessarily. We usually understand renunciation as leaving the world behind. Yes, that can be one way of understanding it. But from the deeper level of Buddha's teaching, what renunciation means is this thought that says, I want to free myself from the suffering of the world, suffering of samsara, and the causes of such suffering. That thought becomes very important thought at the beginning, isn't it? Without that thought, there is no path. How do we begin our path? How do we begin our journey? There is no way. We all have had that thought at some point. That's why, we are here together, taking this journey. But the problem with us is we forget that thought. Once we have started our journey, sometimes you forget that thought, that original motivation, the original purpose of entering such a spiritual journey, such a spiritual path. And we lose that heart of renunciation sometimes, or we don't have that as strong as we used to have it at the beginning. And so the point here is to always generate this thought, always remember the renunciation, always strengthening this heart actually helps oneself to accomplish the path more effectively. Without that thought, without that heart, a path can be sometimes quite tricky. It can feel very normal. When we begin to feel the path being quite normal and snuggly, and when we feel our path having all these qualities of attachment and clinging and still okay, then there's a little bit of problem, as far as journey is concerned. And so therefore, this generating this heart becomes very important for the path here. And this thought of renunciation can only arise on the basis of seeing the suffering, and seeing the truth of suffering, seeing the noble truth of suffering clearly, and the causes of suffering. And we can see that, we can experience that, we can reflect on that, and then feel, yes, I want to renounce this. I want to be free. And so therefore, the thought of renunciation is the beginning of developing compassion. And this is what we call compassion towards oneself. This is necessary, very necessary. Without developing this sense of softness, soft heart of compassion towards oneself, there's no way we can develop compassion towards the other sentient beings. For that reason, this thought of renunciation is not only important for Hinayana journey, but also it becomes important for Mahayana, Mahayana journey. And so therefore you can see how renunciation plays an important role in our journey here. And you can see how renunciation is dependent upon understanding and seeing the truth of suffering and the origin of truth of suffering. And you can see how the Four Noble Truths, truth of suffering, truth of origin of suffering, truth of cessation of suffering, truth of path that leads to the cessation of suffering, these all are very important here, right? If you don't see the truth of suffering or origin of truth of suffering, then there's no way we can feel the renunciation at the beginning. But if you just see these two, suffering and the causes of suffering, but don't see the path that leads to the cessation of suffering, don't see the end, which is the cessation of suffering, then seeing the first two truths doesn't help very much, isn't it? It will just bring us more depression. Right? You just see suffering and endless suffering after suffering after suffering. And not only that, but causes of suffering, causes of suffering going on and on and on. What? It leads you deeper and deeper into just heavy heart of pain and suffering of the world. It doesn't really help us very much, just seeing these two. But these two are very important at the beginning. But when you see the third, saying, oh, it's not only suffering, but there is an end of suffering. We can have a freedom from suffering. We can have liberation, achieve freedom from suffering. Then that becomes very uplifting, becomes a very important part of the journey here, saying, oh, not only suffering, but I can fully transform my suffering. I can fully transcend my suffering. That's very important to see. See that you have the wisdom, you have the compassion, you have the power, and there is method to transform our suffering. That becomes very important. But is that enough? No. That's not enough. But we need to see the path that leads to the cessation of suffering, right? There is a suffering, there is an end of suffering, but how do you end this suffering? How do you free oneself from suffering? How we can transform our suffering? That's all what we talk about, the path, right? The path that leads to the cessation of suffering. But you can see, when you have these four all together, then renunciation is naturally there, right? Renunciation is naturally there. You see the suffering which is to be transcended. You see the causes that brings such a suffering, which is definitely need to be transcended, transformed. And you see there is also freedom from such suffering, to be aspired, to be looking forward as a goal. And then you see path that leads to that fruition, that goal. So when you have these all together, renunciation is not a problem, right? It's there naturally. And so therefore Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths first. Four Noble Truths to the Hinayana disciples. That became the primary ground, first foundation, most important of all the journey, because this is the beginning of our journey. Isn't it? Isn't the beginning the most important? So this is like, for example, you are having a very, very busy schedule. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? You're having a really busy schedule and suffering from these busyness and hard work, overtime work, seeing all this suffering, and then somebody tells you about a beautiful, very, natural place to go for vacation, leaving all these trouble, so to speak, behind and go. That is like truth of cessation of suffering, right? Seeing somewhere you can leave everything behind, or you can transform everything into something very peaceful, gentle, and completely free. But just having these two thoughts, one is busyness and the other is that place, just having these two doesn't help us, right? It doesn't help us. What do we need? We need to take a vacation from samsara, right? We need to take a vacation from samsara. We have to hand in our application, asking for leave of absence or vacation or what have you. We have to do that, right? We have to begin. And we have to get our ticket to get there. And we have to pack, we have to leave, we have to take this journey. So beginning becomes the most important, isn't it? The Four Noble Truths is very important for the path. And so therefore, in some sense, Hinayana is not just a group of people. Right, saying these people are Hinayana. Right, I'm something else. There's no such thing. Hinayana is actually beginning part of our journey. This is what we call Hinayana, the beginning point, starting point. Once we have entered that path of Hinayana, and begin to take this journey, then we go further, little bit further. At this point, we're not saying, I want to achieve this freedom from suffering alone, but we say, I want to achieve this for all. Right? For example, at your work, when you see you're the not only person who is busy and suffering, but also the other persons. Maybe some are suffering more than you, right? Maybe some of your clients are suffering more than you. Some of your patients, suffering more than you. So when you see all these things, how can you how can you take a vacation alone? Right? That's a Mahayana approach. How can we take a vacation here? Where we are most needed here. Everybody needs us here, My clients, my colleagues, my patient, everyone is having so much suffering here. How can I just aspire for this vacation alone? So you say, I want to take everyone for vacation. But all sentient beings, we will take for vacation from samsara. To do that is a lot of work, isn't it? Just to take our own vacation takes a lot of work, a lot of saving to take vacation. But to take all sentient beings for vacation, we need a large sum of savings. And for that, we have to work really hard, to give people what they want, where they want to go, right? Not everybody wants to go to Bahamas, right? Not everybody wants to go to Kailash either. Everyone has a different desire. So Mahayana approach is trying to accommodate that. Try to give them what they want, what's best for them. What's best for them to be free from such suffering of samsara. Whichever way it can free them. And so therefore Mahayana approach is working not only for one's own freedom from suffering, but freedom from suffering for all sentient beings. So you can see the connection here now between renunciation and compassion. Renunciation is a thought of wanting to free from suffering and the causes of suffering directed towards oneself. And compassion is the same thought directed towards others. Without having the first, you can't have the second. Without having renunciation, you can't have a compassion. If we don't see the suffering of samsara, and if we don't have our aspiration, desire to be free from such a suffering, how can we have the same desire for others? It's almost impossible. In English, you have a saying, what you say, like, I've been there, right? If you haven't been there, you don't know that suffering really. If we haven't seen our own suffering of samsara, you can see the other person's suffering of samsara. It's difficult to see that. And so therefore, Mahayana heart of compassion becomes the key element of the journey here in the Mahayana path. Mahayana, which means a greater vehicle. The greater here is greater in vision. You're not only visioning isolated individual salvation, individual freedom from suffering, but your vision is freedom for all. It's a greater vision. And secondly, it's called a greater vehicle because it has a greater wisdom, greater skillful means to free from suffering. The earlier on the Hinayana path, the wisdom is limited, the skillful means is limited. But here in the Mahayana, wisdom and skillful means is unlimited. It's a great, that's why it's called a great vehicle. Secondly, and the third, it's called greater because our goal is greater. What we want to achieve is not only a temporary relief from suffering, temporary relief from the causes of suffering, but achieving the absolute state of enlightenment, a complete state of a Buddhahood. That's why it's called also greater vehicle, Mahayana. And so therefore in the second turning, in the second stage, then Buddha taught the Mahayana path, where the heart of compassion is very important. The heart of enlightenment, bodhicitta, is very important. The heart of enlightenment, heart of bodhicitta, is saying that I want all sentient beings to achieve enlightenment, complete Buddhahood. That's what the heart of enlightenment is. And so, therefore, Buddha said, compassion and heart of enlightenment, the bodhicitta here, they are like, Buddha said, they are like the seed of enlightenment at the beginning. Without the seed, there's no way we can get anything. Right? The seed is the beginning. So compassion and bodhicitta is like the seed in the beginning, and they are like the water in the middle. When you're on the path, generating compassion again and again, generating bodhicitta again and again, becomes like watering your seed. Just planting the seed is not enough. You have to have these conditions, like water. Very important condition is the water. That's why it's a good reminder to have a plant in the room. You can see how the plant dies if you don't water. I've had that experience. Not only once, but all the time. And so you can see how this watering process is important, It's quite important. So that seed to grow, it's very important to have the water. So compassion and bodhicitta is like the water in the middle to grow the seed of enlightenment. Then Buddha said they are like the warmth of the sun at the end. To have this seed to grow into full ripening stage of fruition, then you need the warmth, you need the heat to ripen. Like that, compassion and bodhicitta ripens this seed to the state of a complete Buddhahood, enlightenment. So therefore, at this point, most important thing is the heart of compassion that goes beyond any boundaries. Compassion without a limit, this compassion is equal compassion for all beings, no bias compassion. So that's what Mahayana is training in. That's what we are training in at the stage of Mahayana, the second stage. To have this compassion, boundless, limitless compassion. And this compassion, to be genuine, then we should have a compassion that is without any expectations in return. If we have a compassion with expectation, then that doesn't become a genuine compassion. But if you have a compassion without any expectation in return, then that becomes a genuine, complete, full Mahayana compassion. Right? When you can just give without even thinking about what you will get in return. Whether you're giving material gift, or whether you're giving a wisdom gift, or whether you're giving a gift of aspiration, anything, whatever you're giving. And if you give without expectation, that is not only becoming a genuine compassion that helps the other being, but also it helps to free oneself, right? When you give a gift of compassion with limit, with expectation, then we are also suffering a lot. We're waiting for this result, expecting something in return. When it doesn't happen, then compassion creates more suffering. And so therefore, when we can give totally without any expectation in return, it becomes the greatest compassion, genuine compassion. And so that's the second stage where we train in the Mahayana path. And then the third stage is then the stage of the Vajrayana journey. And then in the Vajrayana journey, Vajrayana literally means indestructible vehicle. Vajra is indestructible. Yana is vehicle. And indestructible here means that the Vajrayana heart, the path of Vajrayana, cannot be affected by any obscurations, by any defilements, by any emotions, disturbing emotions or anything such. And it's like a diamond that can cut through other stones, but the other stones cannot affect the diamond. That's why it's like the Vajra. And so in the Vajrayana, then it goes even further with more skillful means. There's a tremendous power of skillful means in the Vajrayana. And in the Vajrayana journey, then enlightenment does not only become our goal, but Vajrayana says enlightenment is right here. It's not far. So difference between Mahayana and Vajrayana is Mahayana is taking enlightenment still as a goal, something to be achieved. And you are on the path to achieve that goal. Whereas in the Vajrayana it says the goal is also your path. And path is also your goal. There is no difference. If you are fully on the path of Vajrayana, then you are at the stage of fruition, on the stage of your result. And so therefore Vajrayana is trying to point out enlightenment being present right here in this very moment of whoever we are embarking on the path, through vast and profound methods of showing this. And so for that reason, Vajrayana is seen as the most highest and most profound path of all Buddhism. And so at this retreat of Treasure of Knowledge, we're going to discuss the Vajrayana path a little bit more in depth. And so before we do that, I wanted to remind everyone of this basic progression, the whole journey, to keep in your mind. The heart of renunciation is important here to work with. And then the heart of course, compassion and bodhicitta is very necessary. And with having these two, the path of Hinayana and the path of Mahayana, then yes, we can discuss the Vajrayana. It becomes more complete. It's a progression. And so therefore, before we discuss Vajrayana Tantra, it's important for us to reflect on these two and practice them a little bit. The heart of renunciation and the heart of compassion and bodhicitta.